one more time to the Center for Persian Studies. It is a pleasure to have you in these programs in the afternoon. Today we have a special guest from Italy, via Philadelphia. But the proper introduction for Gioele will be done by Professor Carlo Ceretti, who holds the chair in Zoroastrian Studies here at UCI and is beginning to teach also Sasanian inscriptions to certain students, which is really great, but he does many more things. So, Doctor, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. خوش آمدید به Jordan Center. It is a pleasure to introduce Gioele Zisa. Gioele Zisa has a very specific and in a way individual curriculum, because he has first graduated in Assyriology, Assyriology being the way in which in Europe we define Mesopotamian studies at LMU in Munich. And then once he obtained his first PhD, he studied for a second PhD in anthropology, focusing on the Iranian world, and more specifically on the Naqali recitation of the Shahnameh. He then went back to his first passion, working again on Assyriology, together with a team in Sapienza University, Lorenzo Verderame, Franco D'Agostino, and so on, that focus mainly on Akkadic and Assyrian texts. And he recently won, I think 1 year ago, more or less, a Marie Curie Global Fellowships. Marie Curie Global Fellowships are extremely prestigious in Europe because, at least in Italy, they open the way for tenure track associate professor positions in our universities. And the focus of this Marie Curie, that is called Planet, is on the plant world of Mesopotamia and how this interacts with material and non-material material culture. So it is extremely important, innovative in a way, and it also relates to the interests of some of our PhD students that focus on environmental institute. In the framework on environmental history, in the framework of this global Marie Curie fellowship, Gioele is spending 2 years at the UniPenn, at the end of these 2 years he will return in Sapienza. While here on the West Coast, he agreed to give a talk at the Jordan Center, and his talk will focus, well, in theory, but the general title is on the Cedars of the Zagros mountain, as you can see, but it will also focus very much on Mesopotamian interaction with the Zagros and therefore with the Iranian Plateau. Thank you very much, and Gioele.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you, Carlo, thank you to Raj, thank you everybody for to be here. So the question that we would like to address today concern a long-standing problem in Assyriological scholarship. So that is the identification of the Sumerian term Erin, a long word from the Akkadian term Erenu, which means cedar. But another problem is the location of the so-called cedar forest, very famous in Mesopotamian tradition, especially in the 3rd millennium BCE. This is particularly significant since in southern Mesopotamia, so today Iraq, we don't have so much trees. There are no trees, no? So that means that timber must be imported from outside, from the Zagros mountains or from the north part of the Mesopotamia, so Syria and southern Anatolia. So large trees do not grow in Mesopotamia, so this is why they needed to organize a huge expedition to bring, usually through rivers or through canals, all these timber material that are fundamental for the construction of temples or palaces in ancient Mesopotamia. So we know from the 1st millennium BCE, especially from the Assyrian period, but even in the Achaemenid period, especially from the royal inscription, that the cedar comes from the Levantine region, from the Lebanon or from the Amarnus mountains in Syria. That is the natural habitat of the Cedrus libani. So the Cedrus libani, the cedar, grows exactly in that part, in the northwest of the Mesopotamia. However, in the 3rd millennium and the beginning of the 2nd millennium, Sumerian sources present a more complex and problematic picture. The vast majority of the texts align with this northwestern orientation in the territory of Ebla, so in Syria, in the Amanus Mountains. However, a small part of this text, but yet significant text, seems to point this cedar forest in another location, in the west, in the east, probably in the Zagros mountain or in the Iranian plateau, where the cedar does not grow. So this is quite a problem. So this apparent eastern shift from west to east of the cedar has led scholars to question the traditional identification of Sumerian term Erin, proposing instead that the term reflects a more broader ethnobotanical classification compassing other conifers native to Zagros, for example, cypress or junipers. But in this lecture, I argue that there is no need to abandon the identification of Erin, the Sumerian Erin, as a cedar. The Zagros problem should not be understood as an issue of ethnobotanical classification, but as an evidence of a different spatial and conceptual logic. So the references to the Cedar Mountains in the Iranian plateau do point to the integration of the Zagros mountain, in general the Iranian plateau, into a Mesopotamian conceptual geography of alterity. So from this perspective, the cedar forest is not simply a fixed geographical location, but a mobile and ideologically charged landscape. So distant mountains regions, whatever, in the Levant or in the Zagros and the Iranian world, share key features: remoteness, elevation, association with valuable non-local resources, especially timber, but not only timber, stones, metals, and so on. So this Eastern or Iranian dimension of the tradition reflects a process of narrative and ideological reframing. Accordingly, Erin, the cedar, emerges not merely as a botanical designation, but as a culturally coherent category associated with non-locality, prestige, and high value. Now, with these premises in mind, I will first reset the term Erin in Sumerian in the lexical Sumerian text, before turning to the location or the conceptual function of the cedar forest. Now, Mesopotamian lexical lists are composed within the scribal schools, so they are primarily intended for training purpose. So actually to learn how to write that words. No? They are not botanical treatises. They don't aim to describe the natural world in empirical terms, but still, they are not disconnected from the reality. On the contrary, they operate at an intersection between the linguistic or rhetoric quantification and environmental perception. It's interesting that the term erin, cedar, appears frequently together with other conifers, with the cypress, shurmin in Sumerian, or juniper, zabalum in Sumerian. This cluster is consistent across different versions of lexical list, from the beginning of the 3rd millennium to the beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE, the so-called Old Babylonian period. This is an Old Babylonian manuscript of this text, so-called Ura Hubullu, where you see there are this list of trees, so cedar, cypress, and juniper. But after juniper, we found Elamacum. And Elamacu recalls the Elam. According to some scholars, this term is compared to the Hebrew word algumim, which is a type of wood mentioned in the Bible as important by an identified region of Ophir. It was sometimes identified with the sandalwood from India. These are a clear sign of this huge trade in the 3rd millennium from India to Mesopotamia. But what is interesting is that this tree, Elamcum from Elam probably, was used for architectural use, such as the cedar. It appears always in the same cluster of conifers. For example, we have an interesting Old Babylonian inscription of the king Anam, who says, "I filled that temple with very large doors of cedar and Elamacum wood brought from the mountains." So Elamacu, cedar, shurmin, and zabalam are all trees that comes from the mountains, from remoteness place, from very distant places. But it's really interesting the fact that we found similar groupings of trees also in literary composition. Mythological texts, hints, or royal inscriptions, where we found always the triad cedar, cypress, and juniper, sometimes expanded with tashkarin, probably the buxwood. Why is this important? Because it's a very clean sign of intertextuality. No? Lexical lists are used as a source of inspiration even for the literary compositions. So in the literary composition, as well as in the lexical lists, the term erin appears always together with other kind of conifers. And you have here some examples of literary composition where the trees appear together. But if we look at the 1st millennium BCE, this is a version of the text Ura Hubullu, this lexical list, we see that the term erin, cedar, appears in the section that lists types of forest. In this sequence, the cedar forest appears immediately after the pure forest, a position that marks a conceptual threshold. From a sacred domain, the list shifts toward a more differentiated classification of specific tree forests, and particularly conifers. So cedar occupies a very liminal position between the secret mountains, the secret forest, and the natural one, the real ones. In another passages, the mountain of cedar appears as a geographical entity within an enumerations of foreigner lands. And significantly, it's grouped among eastern regions such as Gutium, Elam, Markashi, and Lulupu, reinforcing the association between the Cedar Mountains and the Zagros and the Iranian Plateau, where actually, again, the cedar does not grow. This is the problem. But in lexical list, erin, so cedar, appears to function as a member of a cluster of high-value woods, evergreen conifers, associated always with mountain environment. And even though these texts are not botanical in nature, their internal organization reveals semantic regularities that reflect a culturally structured perception of the natural world. But more importantly, erin, cedar, does not designate only a tree, stricto sensu, but it generates a broader context, no? Ecological, no? The idea of the forest of cedar, the pure forest, and also geographically speaking, the land, the mountain of the cedars, no? Such as the land of Lulu, the land of Guti, the land of Marhash, and so on. But let's now move from lexical text to another kind of evidence, so the royal inscriptions and historical records and literary compositions. These sources show how cedar was valued, acquired, and represented in 3rd millennium and 2nd millennium Mesopotamian sources, where the cedar emerges not only as a resource, but as a political and ideological object. Throughout Mesopotamian history and even in the Achaemenid period, cedar occupies a position of exceptional prestige, associated with monumental construction and elite craftsmanship. Even in Persepolis, we know that some temples palaces were built with cedar wood from Lebanon. So its physical qualities, durability, workability, and especially fragrance made it suited to contexts requiring both technical performance and symbolic value. In architecture, cedar is prominently used in temples and palaces, particularly for doors and structural elements. For example, in the cylinder A of Gudea, this famous ruler of the city of Lagash in southern Mesopotamia in the 22nd century before the BCE, the cedar wood appears as a key element for the temple of the god Ningirsu, and especially for the beams, the columns, and the door. We know also, probably you know Gilgamesh story, and we have all Babylonian tablets of the Gilgamesh story written in Akkadian, and in this composition, especially in the episode of Gilgamesh and Hubaba, who is the guardian of the cedar forest, we know that after the killing of Hubaba by Gilgamesh, Enkidu, the friend of Gilgamesh, decided to bring one cedar from the cedar forest in order to construct a door for the temple of Enlil in Nippur in southern Mesopotamia, in order to, as a gift for the god Enlil. But we will return about this story later on. So the cedar is the wood for temple doors, per excellence. These doors marked the passage between the human and the divine. And we know actually archaeobotanical evidence confirms this picture. Remains of cedar wood have been identified in Mari in Syria, in Nuzi in Upper Mesopotamia, and already in the Anna temple, the famous temple in Uruk in southern Mesopotamia, in the second half of the 4th millennium BCE. Cedar also play an important role in culting shipbuilding. Literary texts describe the felling of cedars in distant mountains for the construction of divine barges. At the same time, cedar is associated with objects of power, messes, scepters, and thrones, functioning as a materialization of royal and divine authority. And you have all the reference here on the slide. To these dimensions, we must add its sensory fragrance. Cedar's fragrance makes it central in purification rituals and fumigations, where it acts as a medium between human and divine spheres. It belongs to the category of the so-called great wood, Gish Galgal in Sumerian, together with the cypress and the juniper. A key term in this context is shim in Sumerian, traditionally identified or translated as resin. However, since cedar does not normally produce resin, unless stressed. When you cut the branches or you cut the bark of the cedar, in that case it produces resin. So it's more probably that the term shim in Sumerian means actually the aromatic wood, no? The shaving of the wood like this, still used today in a New Age or New Paganism rituals. From the wood of the cedar, perfumed oil were produced as well. For example, they put some pieces of wood into fat or sesame oil to produce this perfumed oil. For example, in this text, Ninisina B, the goddess Ninisina oils herself with perfume oil made of wood. Cedar's fragrance also takes an erotic ritual dimension. In Sumerian love literature, the oil of cedars prepares the bridal bed of the goddess Inanna and her spouse Dumuzi. And even in Old Babylonian Akkadian text, so in text at the beginning of dated to the beginning of the second millennium BCE, you see we have a lot of text mentioning the cedars or the oil of cedar in this erotic context. So what emerges in this text is a very clear pattern. So cedar cannot be reduced to a mere material, but it constitutes a dense nexus of meanings: economic, architectural, political, ritual, and even erotic. So it's valuable not only because of what is it, so for the qualities of the wood, but also because of where it comes from and what it evokes. It is precisely this combination, so material, exceptional, or sensory power, or geographical distance, that makes cedar such a powerful element in Mesopotamian thought. And because of this, because of its size, durability, and high value, cedar functions as a powerful symbolic marker, condensing idea of strength, prestige, and sacredness. It is therefore used as an epithet of gods, as a metaphor for temple, and the designation of kingship. For example, in the Sumerian composition, the marriage of the god Marduk, Marduk says, "I was the grandfather of the holy cedar." No? And a similar passage appears in the composition Lugale, in which the god Enlil defines his son Ninurta as cedar rooted in the Apsu, a crown with a broader shade. To be clear, the Apsu is in the Mesopotamian cosmology the subterranean freshwater ocean. No? To say that the cedar is rooted in the Apsu, it's given to a cosmic dimension, no? Because its root extends into the depths while its crown spreads across as a protective shade. Cedar does not only represent the gods, it also characterizes the temples that are often described through metaphors of mountain and trees. Again, for example, in the cylinder A of Gudea, we read, "The house looked up like a mountain range between heaven and earth." It is a sappy cedar growing, and then the tablet is broken. And similarly, in another composition, Nanna E, we read, "The god Enlil makes the Eshinugal, the temple, the house of the cedar forest, tower straight upward for you." So the imagery becomes even more striking when the temple is violated. The destruction of the temple is conceptualized as a devastation of a forest. For instance, in the lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Ur, we read, "The fragrant aroma of the sacred seat of the god moon Nanna was destroyed like that of a cedar forest." Mesopotamian kings, especially Neo-Sumerian kings at the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, are often described as cutters of trees, echoing the heroic exploits of Gilgamesh, for example, who went to the cedar forest to cut cedar. But at the same time, these kings are identified with the trees, and especially the cedars. For example, the king Shulgi is like a sappy cedar planted among cashew trees. Cashew is an important tree because we know that grows in Zagros mountain. We discuss this later on. Your father, Holy An, will make his branches shine. So in all these cases, the king is thought as a cedar, tall, stable, life-giving, and protective. And just as the king is a cedar when he lives, so his death can be described as the felling or uprooting of a tree. For example, in the death of Urnamma, another New Sumerian king, we read, like a sappy cedar tree, they uproot him, Urnamma, in the palace where he is lying. Now, royal inscriptions provide vivid testimonies of process of collecting cedar wood. In this text, the procurement of cedar is not only described as a simple act of trade. It's framed as a royal achievement and dabbed with narratives of military expansion and domination. And a well-known motif recurring across several inscriptions is that of the king who reaches distant mountains, subdues his inhabitants, cuts down the forest, and transports the wood back to Mesopotamia. And the act of cutting cedar becomes a performative gesture of power. It demonstrates the king's ability to extend his reach behind the alluvial Mesopotamian plan into regions that are geographically remote and culturally distinct. Royal inscriptions often emphasize the logistical complexity of moving a large timber from mountain regions to the cities of southern Mesopotamia. So rivers and canals are mobilized in order to carry these massive resources across great distances. Once it reaches the city, cedar undergoes to a further transformation. It becomes part of Mesopotamian architecture and craftsmanship. Cedar is not only moved through space, but it is recontextualized. It passes from the domain of austerity, the mountain landscape, into the domain of order, the Mesopotamian city. But now we must ask, where is the cedar forest or the cedar mountain of the third millennium sources located? The vast majority of historical inscriptions clearly point the west, especially northern Syria and southern Anatolia, in particular the Amanus Mountains, where the Cedars Libani was indeed present. All Babylonian and Ur-III Sumerian literary texts, so from the end of the third millennium and beginning of the second millennium, reinforce their location. And you find all the main reference here in the slide. On the slide, I don't discuss them because they are self-explanatory. So if you want, you can take a picture and then read it carefully later. But the contemporary Old Babylonian Akkadian literary tradition confirms this picture. Again, the Old Babylonian Akkadian version of Epic of Gilgamesh, we read that in the word in which Enkidu describes the cedar forest, that Enkidu says, I knew Hubaba, the guardian of the forest, my friend, in the upper land, so in Syria, when I roamed here and there with the herd. For 60 leagues in each direction, the forest is a wilderness. Another table situates the cedar mountain and the cedar forest near the land of Ebla in northern Syria. We read, they drew near to the land of Ebla. Other versions refer to Syrian and Lebanon, again pointing the cedar forest to the northwest. At Hubaba, Yelz, Syrian, so the Mount Hermon, and Lebanon were split asunder. So there was a historical and geographical reality behind the Mesopotamian notion of cedar forest or cedar mountains. This reality was situated in northwestern Mesopotamia, so Syria, and Mesopotamian kings were aware of this region, interact with it, whether with trade or with military campaigns, and integrate it into the political and ideological framework. But yet, as we have seen, this is only one part of the story. Because if we can turn to perhaps the most problematic aspect of this issue, that is the apparent localization of the cedar forest in the eastern regions, in the Zagros or behind the Zagros. But to be clear, unlike the northwestern evidence, these eastern evidence are limited, less explicit, and often embedded in a not geographical context, especially in literary composition or religious composition. We don't possess royal inscriptions describing expedition to the cedar forest in the Zagros. The first royal inscription mentioned expedition to the Zagros, exploitation of the timber resources in the Zagros are dated to the Neo-Assyrian period, so in the first millennium, and not in the second, not in the third millennium BCE. But still, we have Old Babylonian, Sumerian text and Akkadian text mentioning this eastern location of the cedar forest. We already seen that in some first millennium lexical list, the Cedar Mountains were listed together with regions such as Elam and Gutium and Lulubu that are in the east, in the Zagros. And a similar partner appears in the Old Babylonian pseudo-autobiography of the pre-Sargonic king Lugal-Anemundu, who claims domination over the cedar forest, Elam, Marhashi, Gutium, Subartu, Amurru, Sutium, and the mountain of Eanna. So from Elam onward, the sequence follows a southeast and northwest axis east of Mesopotamia. So theoretically placing the Cedar Mountain within an eastern-oriented framework. And that similar ambiguity we found in Old Babylonian Akkadian composition Sargon the King, which is very fragmentary. Interesting because this text, we have Elam, the word Elam, and in a variant, so in another tablet of the same text, we have cedar forest. So the passage is, they will not block my way before Elam. But in another tablet we read, before the cedar forest. Eastern association also occur in Sumerian mythological composition, for example, Enki and the world order. Here the cedar is linked with distant regions such as Melucha, so the Indus Valley in today Pakistan, Magan, Oman, today Oman, and Dilmun, today Bahrain, alongside with precious materials, stones, silver, and gold, you see. I will admire its green cedars. Let the lands of Melucha, Magan, and Dilmun looked upon me, upon Enki, the god Enki. And then the text mentions the timber, the silver, and the gold. But one of the most debated cases is the Sumerian composition of Gilgamesh and Khubaba. Probably you know the canonical epos of Gilgamesh, that of the first millennium written in Babylonian. But actually we have a tablet dealing with the Gilgamesh story at the beginning of the second millennium BCE, written in Akkadian and other written in Sumerian. We already mentioned the Old Babylonian Akkadian version, but now we are dealing with the Sumerian version of the second millennium BCE of Gilgamesh's story. In this composition, we have two compositions in Sumerian, version A and version B. In this version B of the beginning of the second millennium, Gilgamesh reaches the forest only after crossing the seventh mountain. So some scholars have interpreted this as an evidence from an Eastern setting, because in other texts, in other mythological Sumerian texts that dealing with the Iranian plateau, and I will discuss later on, they mention always the seventh mountain. So if also we found the seventh mountain even in the Gilgamesh and Khubaba, for some scholars it is a proof of an eastern location of the cedar mountain. But in my opinion, the seventh mountain is better understood as a rhetorical device, marking distance and difficulty, and not a precise location. In Mesopotamian, seven is a magical name. no? Here, if we have 7 mountains, it's not a precise location to the east, no, but it's a symbolic idea, a rhetoric idea of a distance, no? It crossed the first mountain, then the second mountain, then the third mountain, and so on, and it reaches the cedar forest at the 7th mountain. Again, the same pattern, the same rhetorical strategy is used to describe the 7 supernatural guides sent by the god son Utu to Gilgamesh. Again, 7 supernatural guides. And we read the passage where these 7 entities are described. On earth, they know the way even to Aratta. Aratta is the mythological Iranian city in Mesopotamian sources. They know the passes as the merchants do. They know the mountain crannies like the pigeons. They will guide you through the mountains' valleys. Again, the reference to Aratta reinforces the idea of distant and difficult territories and not a specific Iranian setting. So these supernatural guides know the routes to distant and hard-to-reach regions. So to me, in my opinion, there is no reason to locate the cedar forest in Gilgamesh and Humbaba in the east, in the Zagros mountain. So taken together, these eastern references do not form a coherent geographical tradition comparable to the northwestern one. Here, cedar is not a marker of a precise location, but part of a broader symbolic language associated with distant regions, exotic materials, and alterity. But let's now consider the association between the cedar forest and the sun god Utu, Shamash in Akkadian, an element often used to argue for an eastern localization of the cedar forest. Why? Because the sun rises from the east. In Mesopotamian thought, the daily journey of the sun was often thought as a passage through the mountains. This idea is also tested visually. We have a lot of cylinder seals from the late 3rd millennium BCE that depict the sun rising between the mountains, sometimes in association with trees or animals in hunting scenes. And the Cedar Mountains as a mountain appears among the mountains associated with the sun god Utu. An example is found in this composition, the first one, Utu F, where the goddess Inanna, the goddess of love, of sex and war, addresses the sun god Utu. She has not experience of sexual matter, so she does not know how to have sex. No? This is why she asks to accompany the sun god Utu to the mountains. So there is again an erotic dimension of these mountains, but we don't know actually the connection between the sex and the mountain. And in this passage, as you can see on the slide, several types of mountains are listed. The mountains of herbs, the cedar, hashur, silver, lapis lazuli, and gallu plants. Here the mountains, including the Cedar Mountain, are traversed by the sun in its journey from the east to the west. So they are part of the cosmic itinerary. Again, in Gilgamesh and Humbaba, the connection between the Cedar Mountain and the god sun Utu is made explicit. Enkidu states that a decision that concerns the mountains is Utu's business, while Humbaba, the guardian of the forest, affirms that Utu left him to live all alone in the mountains. So those passages do not localize the Cedar Mountains geographically in the east, but they place it under the jurisdiction of the sun god Utu. Only one text explicitly mark the connection between the Cedar Mountains and the east, the place of the sun rise. And this is the text Inanna I. Here the ruler goes out to the rebel distant mountains that are as far away as Utu rises from the fragrant Cedar Mountains. This is the only text that in the 3rd millennium that explicitly link the sun god and the cedar, this actually the rise of the sun and the Cedar Mountains. Interestingly, we have these topos always in the first millennium. For example, in this prayer to Shamash, Shamash is the sun god in Akkadian sources, where we see, when you, Shamash, rise from the Cedar mountains. And even in an inscription of the New Babylonian king Nabonidus, where we read, just like when from the Cedar mountain Shamash, the great lord, rises up with strong cedars, built a roof over it. The scent of the place is dwelling like that of Hashur forest I made so pleasant. But it's really interesting, the fact that in this inscription, Nabonidus, the king, mentions that he brought the cedars from Lebanon. So he's saying that actually the place of the resource, of the timber resource, is the west, is the Lebanon. But actually he mentioned the sun rises and the east. So it's a very confused idea, no? The forest is in the west, but he mentioned again the text, the rise of the sun in connection with the cedar forest. It's evident that it's a literary topos, and not a precise location. Let us now consider one final piece of the puzzle, that is the relation between the cedar and the Hashur tree. Hashur tree is a mountain conifer that always is linked to the eastern region, to the Zagros mountain. We don't have an exact botanical identification of the Hashur tree. Christopher Wood proposed the Juniperus polycarpus. It's a kind of juniper that grows in the Zagros mountains. Other scholars suggest a species like cypress, but actually this is more problematic because we don't have cypress in the southern part of the Zagros mountain. So the Juniperus polycarpus the best choice. So what is interesting that in Sumerian Old Babylonian literature, the cedar appears often together with the Hashur tree. This is why some scholars, some Assyriologists have interpreted the pair, cedar and Hashur, as an ecological pair. No? They are written together, that means that they are together geographically speaking. But in my opinion, I want to show you how this is not an ecological pair, but actually an oppositional ecological, cosmological pair. So they represent symbolically two opposite play. And I will show you some example here in the slide. For example, in the text Utu-B, so it is a hymn dedicated to the sun god Utu, we read Utu-Bu as a bull who drinks among the Sepi cedars, while who grows on the mount Hashur, where actually the Hashur tree grow. Here Utu is linked to different trees, the cedar associated with the water, and the Hashur mount, it's called the Hashur mountain, associated with its rising. It reflects a cosmic opposition, the realm of waters, often connected with the Apsu and the Euphrates, so to the west, and the realm of sunrise, where the Utu grows, associated to the east. This interpretation becomes more clear in other texts. For example, in another incantation to the sun god Utu, where we read, Utu, the northern seas, so the Mediterranean Sea, are yours. Utu, the southern seas, so the Persian Gulf, are yours. Utu, the Cedar Mountains, the Hashur Mountains, are yours. Here, Cedar and Hashur are explicitly paired as a cosmic boundaries, much like the seas themselves. So the west and the east, like the North Sea and the South Sea. And this opposition continues into the first millennium. For example, in the Utu prayer, is a prayer again to the god Shamash, the sun god, we read, Utu, the upper sea belongs to you. Utu, the lower sea belongs to you. Utu, the mountain cedars belongs to you, as the mountain Hashur trees belongs to you. So the pair Erin, Cedar, and Hashur should be understood not simply as ecological association, but as a mythological geographical polarity organized along the east-west axis defined by the movement of the sun. So west, sunset, up to Euphrates, the cedar, and east, sunrise, and the homonymous Mount Hashur and the Hashur tree. But let me return to a central question. Does the Sumerian term Erin in the 3rd millennium really mean cedar and only cedar? So the identification of Erin with the Cedrus libani is not problematic, in my opinion. All documented uses correspond to the known properties of the cedar: durability, resistance to decay in insects, straight grain, workability, and distinctive fragrance. These qualities match the uses described in the sources: construction, fine woodworking, fumigation, perfumed oil. And cedar sides up to 30 meters in height with trunk over 2 meters of diameter also make it suitable for beams and monumental architecture. Ecologically, cedar is a mountain conifer growing in the forest with pine and fir, and its natural distribution is limited to the eastern Mediterranean, so Lebanon, Syria, south and central Turkey. Paleoecological data confirm this. So cedar pollen is attested in Lebanon and in Syria, with evidence of progressive deforestation from the early Holocene, intensifying in the middle Holocene, and continuing through the Bronze and Iron Ages due to Egyptian and Assyrian exploitation. And what about the direct archaeobotanical evidence? From the New Assyrian period, also in the Achaemenid period, archaeobotanical studies clearly show that cedar wood was imported from Lebanon and from the Taurus and used in Mesopotamian centers and even in Persepolis, confirming the royal inscriptions. From early period, from the 3rd millennium in southern Mesopotamia, the situation is more complex. We have so much direct evidence. This is due to preservation condition. No? The alluvial environment in southern Mesopotamian, the lagoons, tend to destroy organic materials such as wood. This is why we don't have so much archaeobotanical remains. Actually, we know we find cedar wood for a door in Uruk and even in Asanlu in Iran in the 2nd millennium. So this data confirms that real cedar circulated widely, even reaching regions that are very far from its natural habitat, from Lebanon to Asanlu, for example. And even royal inscriptions, at least from the middle of the 3rd millennium, confirms that the cedar forest is located in the northwest. No doubt about this. So you have here a map about the pollen data, so the paleoecological setting, and as you can see, the pollen of cedar have been found just in Syria and in Lebanon. But now I remember some old Babylonian literary texts seems to place cedar forest in the east, in the Zagros, or even behind, where there is no species of cedar. The only cedar found in the east is the Cedrus deodara, native to the western Himalaya, so in the eastern region of Afghanistan. It is quite far. But the problem is not that it's far. We don't have direct rivers that can bring this massive quantity of timber from Afghanistan to Mesopotamia. So it's impossible that the text mention this kind of cedar. And the vegetation today of Zagros is well known. We have in the north oak forest with juniper species, the Juniperus polycarpus. In the center and south regions we have oak, pistachio, maple, almond, pear, and steppe vegetation. But one question would be, could cedar have existed in the past? No? Do you have any proof of pollen of cedar in the Zagros? No. Recent paleoecological studies based on pollen suggest this evidence. So no evidence of cedar have been found in the Zagros or in the Lake Urmia region, at least in the last 5 millennia. I have to say that we don't have any paleoecological data from southern east part of the Zagros, but we are sure that we don't have any kind of cedar there as well. To resolve this discrepancy, so between the text, actually the natural habitat of the cedar, some scholars have proposed that the term erin in Sumerian might not always refer to the cedar. So in Eastern context, it could designate other conifers, such as the Juniperus excelsa and the subspecies the Juniperus polycarpus, known as a Persian juniper, that actually grow in the southern part of Zagros. But we have 2 problems with this hypothesis. The first one is that the juniper does not form large, dense forests like cedar. And the main characteristic of the cedar, even in the text, is this huge forest where in front of which humans are so small, no? Because it's the power of the gods, no? We don't have any kind of this for the junipers. In addition, if we look at all the Mesopotamian, Sumerian mythological texts that are that are located in the Zagros Mountains and the Iranian Plateau, in the description of the forest, there is no mention of cedar. And this is, of course, really important, because if you think that erin is a generic term for conifers, and we know that conifers grow in the Zagros, we should expect the term erin even in that text that describes the Zagros or the Iranian plateau. So now I'm sure that you have a question in your mind, that is, how the Zagros forest or the forest of the Iran are described in Sumerian mythological sources. In Mesopotamian thought, the eastern plateau, especially the Zagros, marked the limits of political control and cultural familiarity. They were associated with the mountain terrain, valuable resources such as timber, precious stones, metals, and distant, often adversarial polities such as Elam, Anshan, and Markashi, as well as the mythical city of Aratta. This perception is embedded in the Sumerian term Kur. Kur is a very polysemantic word in Sumerian. It designates not only mountain, but also the netherworld, the underworld. And its reduplication, Hur, means foreigner lands. So the Zagros range was home to groups such as Gutians and Lulubids, frequently depicted in Sumerian literature as uncivilized and threatening. So wild, animal-like people, homeless, incapable of human speech. In contrast to the ordered place of the city, the mountains, the Zagros, are represented as hostile and untamed, inhabited by dangerous beings, Vishvezan, demons, witches, and even disease. At the same time, this Zagros landscape is not always negative. The Zagros wilderness is an ambiguous and therefore liminal place, combining the danger with secret significance. Some mountains bear the divine determinative Dingir, so that are related with the divine world. No? The forests are described as the dwelling of the gods. They are places of majesty, beauty, and cosmic importance, associated with the origins of pure substances such as healing plants. So this ambivalence, positive and negative of the Zagros Mountains, are clearly illustrated in Sumerian literary composition. You have here the famous Naram-Sin stele, where the king Naram-Sin is declaring victory among the Lulubis from the Zagros Mountain. As you can see here, the oak tree as a sign of alterity, is the sign of the mountains par excellence. But at the same time, we have cylinder depicting the mountain as a god. So this very ambivalent the way in which Mesopotamians look at the Zagros mountains. And I want to give you some example of this. One of the most important compositions in Sumerian date to the end of the third millennium and the beginning of the second millennium is Inanna and Ebich. Here the goddess Inanna confronts the divine mountain Ebich while wandering through the regions of Elam, Subir, and Lunubi, so in the east. So the mountain has been identified either with Jebel Amrin, an extension of the western Zagros in northeastern Iraq, or with Kabir Ku on the Iranian border between Elam and Lorestan. Ebich's refusal to submit, symbolizing by its refusal to bow, constitutes a distinct, a clear challenge to divine authority. This is why Inanna is very enraged and appeals to her father, An, the sky god, for permission to destroy Ebich. However, An rejects Inanna's request, portraying Ebich as the pure dwelling of the gods, a place of immense aura, Melam in Sumerian. The mountain is depicted as a lush forest, rich in towering trees, abundant fruits, and a thriving wildlife. So the trees present on the mountains are limited to Hashur, so we confirm the eastern location of the mountain, and also Alamun, which means oak in Sumerian. But despite An's refusal, Inanna decides to destroy Ebich. Another interesting text is part of the so-called Lugalbanda cycle. In this Lugalbanda cycle is composed by three compositions. The first one is Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta. Here, the eastern mountains of the Iranian plateau form the dramatic backdrop of Uruk's rival, the city of Aratta. The story presents a growing tension between Mesopotamian and the Iranian lands. Uruk, the most famous city in national Mesopotamia, seeks to subdue Aratta, a wealth city rich in raw materials such as gold, silver, and lapis lazuli. In this narrative, the goddess Inanna, who is the goddess of the city of Uruk, advises the ruler of Uruk and Merkar to send a messenger eastward. The envoy must cross the Zubi Mountains, so part of the Zagros mountain, pass through Susa and the land of Amshar, and finally traverse 7 mountains before reaching Aratta. These mountains are described as vast as dangerous. Their root forms snares, their branches traps. At the same time, they are rich in fruit trees like figs and vines. The king of Aratta boasts that these mountains, although they seem delicate as a sparrow, are as powerful as the claws of the lion-headed bird, Anzud, that you can see on the slide. He doubts that the men of Uruk could even overcome them. This rivalry continues between Uruk and Aratta, continues in Lugalbanda in the cave of the mountain. During the campaign against Aratta, Lugalbanda falls ill while crossing the Zagros mountains, and believed to be dead, is left behind by his 7 brothers, again 7, in a cave. The cave is described as the most terrifying place on earth. Alone in this hostile and remote environment, Lugalbanda turns to the god, Utu, the sun god, Inanna, this Venus, and Annasuen, the moon god, and miraculously healed. When he emerges from the cave, the landscape has changed. He finds himself in a rich and vibrant forest, full of water, plants, animals. There are trees such as Kashur again, and Shenu trees, herds of wild bulls and goats. The same mountains that were a place of danger now became a place of renewal and abundance. Lugalbanda eats healing plants, hunts, makes offerings, and regains his strength. The story continues in Lugalbanda and Anzud, this strange creature. In the mountain forest, Lugalbanda encounters Anzud. This is a very powerful lion-headed eagle, appointed by Enlil as a guardian of the mountain. Seeking its favor, Lugalbanda cares for the bird's young, feeding them and decorating them with branches of white cedar, which is another kind of tree, is not the cedar actually. When Anzud returns, it is amazed and offers him rich rewards. But Lugalbanda decides something else, the speed. Understanding this, Anzud grants him with extraordinary speed, allowing him to continue his journey through the Zagros Mount. So these old Babylonian Sumerian mythological compositions show that the Zagros Mountains are not merely geographical entity, but they function as a zones of alterity. Zagros Mountains and forests are depicted as dark, inaccessible, and menacing spaces. In Lugalbanda, in the cave of the mountain, the forests become a locus of mortal disease, while in Lugalzanda and Anzud, the creature, evoke terror, like Khubaba in Gilgamesh and Khubaba. The mountain's rebellious nature necessitates its defeat by force. In Inanna and Ebich, the mountain's audacity provokes the goddess who destroys it. By contrast, mortal rulers are compelled to rely on cunning rather than force. Lugalbanda, in order to gain the support of Anzud, adorns its cheeks and feeds them. Likewise, Gilgamesh outwits Khubaba through an ingenious exchange of gifts in order to obtain the wood and his power. By force, the heroes cannot defeat the guardians of the forest. So the Zagros Mountains and their forests are described at the same time as a highly lush and related to the divine sphere. Anzud, Lugalbanda, is tasked by Enlil as Khubaba with gardening the forest. Ebich is portrayed as the abode of the gods, a mountain that reaches the heavens, exhausting a terrifying aura. In Lugalbanda, in the cave of the mountain, the forest initially appears dangerous and dark when the hero falls ill during this mountain crossing. However, after receiving divine aid, Lugalbanda emerges from the cave into a lush landscape. It is in this transformed, almost otherworldly place that he receives by Anzu supernatural qualities. So the immense trees of the forest and their guardians inspire deep awe. At the same time, the forest is also depicted as a locus amenus, a place of abundance of natural resources. So in conclusion, the relative few references to cedar forest in the Zagros in all Babylonian literary texts should not be understood in strictly geographical terms. The cedar forest or the cedar mountains in these sources does not necessarily coincide with the cedar forest of the royal inscriptions. What unites this tradition is a shared ideological horizon rather than a fixed localization. By the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, royal discourse had already established cedar as both as a material resources and symbol of domination. And all Babylonian literary texts inherits and rework this dual significance. So references to cedar in Eastern context function as rhetorical construction within a mythological and religious framework. In this setting, the Eastern Cedar Mountain acts as a locus of alterity, a remote and symbolically charged space that frames heroic achievement, royal legitimacy, and political reach. Cedar functions not merely as a botanical referent, but as a cultural category integrating multiple dimensions: the cedar forest, the cedar mountains, and the cedar timber converge into a unified semantic field, making cedar the tree of alterity par excellence. In its association with other valued conifers such as the cypress, Ashur, and Juniper likely contributed to extending the idea of a cedar forest behind the strict botanical limits. In this perspective, the cedar forest emerges as a conceptual space, spanning the entire Mesopotamian horizon, from the Mediterranean, so from the west, to the east, to the Zagros and the Iranian Plateau, where geography, ideology, and cosmology intersect. Thank you.